Okay, and last but not least, we're going to talk about fascism. Now, this is a term that is being thrown around all over American politics now. Um, People are calling governors fascists, they're calling Republicans fascists. So, you know, how does fascism differ from communism? Fascism and communism are really pretty far apart. Where it gets blurry is the difference between fascism and your typical authoritarian regime. Okay, so when we talk about fascism, developed in the 1920s, essentially in Italy with Mussolini, and then Hitler. Um, and it's kind of a unique form of authoritarianism where they don't, it's not just about strict and rigid laws and control of basic freedoms. Fascism has a few elements that really distinguish it. Okay, number one is it usually centers around a very charismatic individual. There's like a head of state um, that really kind of brings about this groundswell of popular support. That it taps into a very, very, very strong populism. Um, Also, under fascism, there is a strong, unfortunately, there's a very often a very strong racial component to this, or, a racist component to it, where one of the ways that you justify your extreme nationalism is by creating a threat from abroad that often is reflected in a certain group or ethnicity. In World War II, obviously, Hitler was able to rally much of the country, much of Germany, around this idea um, that the Jewish race was, an existential threat to Germany, and that all the hardships that Germany was facing in the 30s was a result that had experienced in the 20s and was experiencing in the 30s when he came to power, was a direct result of a vast global Jewish conspiracy. And it's not a far leap from when you take desperate people and you give them this vein of, this is why you are struggling, this is why you can't feed your families, this is the group that is responsible. When you are able to completely um, concentrate, laser focus that message, it can be very, very effective to taking otherwise intelligent populations and having them fall into what we saw in World War II during the Holocaust, in which essentially there was a Nazi mission known as the Final Solution, to exterminate every Jewish person on the continent of Europe. And when it was all said and done, they would succeed in eliminating about 6.5 million people, most of which were of Jewish descent, or were Jewish. Um, they also went after homosexuals, the disabled, Roma populations, because they saw them as genetically inferior, or a threat to the supremacy of the German race. So this is an incredibly dangerous ideology. Another thing that fascists tend to do is they really love to weaponize the government and go after the press, go after institutions. They're more than willing to change laws um, to benefit themselves. Um, you know, if you don't like the politics of a corporation, you go after it. All of these things, by their very nature, can be sort of like warning signs about fascism that you need to keep your eyes out for. Another thing about fascism is that it is often extremely militaristic, almost always militaristic. It is often expansive and combative, because the fascist state is a state that is almost perpetually at war to not only expand resources and to take things from other countries, but it's also part of the narrative. We are a superior nation. It's this extreme nationalism, usually centered around one individual, that we need to expand. We deserve to expand. We are owed the resources. You can make extremely strong arguments that what's going on in Russia right now with under Vladimir Putin is a fascist movement. The Z that you see painted all over the tanks that are entering into Ukraine. It is expansivist in nature. There is a genocidal element, meaning that openly the regime in Russia is openly stating that they do not believe that the Ukrainian state has a right to exist, and also that the Ukrainian ideology or nationality is a fictitious creation that doesn't deserve to exist. And when you start saying things like that, not only is that make it genocide by international definitions, but also strongly promotes this sort of racial superiority or ethnic superiority and justification for trying to eliminate entire populations. Fascism is an incredibly dangerous ideology when it takes hold, but it usually takes hold in times of desperation, when a nation feels like it has lost strength or people feel hopeless. You center around one figure, and they can really create a dangerous level of a dangerous type of populism that we often call fascism. But cling tight to this definition, because authoritarianism is not necessarily fascism. They're not the same things. Hopefully I've explained to you more clearly exactly some of the differences. It's not just about rigid rules like you see under totalitarianism or authoritarianism. There is a different component. Under communism, what's interesting is that we've seen communism amongst all groups. We've seen communism and the ideology take off in Africa. We've seen it take off in Asia. We have seen it take off in Europe. In communism, it's about being communist. There's very seldom an actual racial element that enters into, as far as, any group of people in the world that adopts the communist ideology can become communist. But that's not the case with fascism. Fascism, once it takes hold in a country, it's individualistic to that country, but there are certain traits that we look for. Okay, an extreme nationalism, an extreme militarism justifies a war and expansion constantly, usually centers around one person. There's unfortunately a strong racial or a racist element to it. Myths of genetic superiority, things like that, and always defending against a constant threat. So I hope these brief explanations have helped you understand the differences between these ideologies. Please continue below and take our second World 101 module. And it goes a little bit more in depth about fascism, kind of shows you the journey that it's been on. What you will be required to do in your assignments for this is to be able to pick out fascist speeches, a speech more likely from a communist leader, a fascist leader, etc., just to make sure that you can identify some of the key differences amongst these ideologies. I hope this has been helpful.